The U.S. government has been complicit in many forms of systemic racism and violence against Black Americans. Some of the most egregious actions include: 1. Slavery, 1619-1865. For over 200 years, Black people were enslaved in the U.S. The government supported the institution of slavery, treating enslaved people as property, with brutal conditions and no rights. 2. The Three-Fifths Compromise, 1787. In the U.S. Constitution, Black people were counted as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, reinforcing their inferior status. The Three-Fifths Compromise was an agreement reached during the United States Constitutional Convention of 1787, aimed at resolving a contentious debate between northern and southern states regarding how enslaved people should be counted when determining a state's population for legislative representation and taxation. Background. Context of the dispute. Southern states, where slavery was widespread, wanted to count enslaved people fully to increase their representation in the House of Representatives, as seats in the House were apportioned based on state population. However, they didn't want enslaved people counted for taxation purposes. Northern states, where slavery was less prevalent, argued that since enslaved people were not treated as free citizens, they should not be counted for representation purposes, but should be counted for taxation. The compromise. Proposal. It was proposed that enslaved people would count as 3/5 of a person for both representation in Congress and direct taxation. Outcome. Each enslaved individual would be counted as 3/5 of a free person when calculating a state's total population. This formula was used to determine: 1. Representation in the House of Representatives. More population meant more representatives for a state. 2. Taxation by the federal government. Population totals were also used to allocate federal taxes among the states. Key points. 1. Impact on southern states. The compromise gave the southern states more power in the House of Representatives than if enslaved people were excluded from the population count, but less than if they had been fully counted. 2. Impact on northern states. While the North conceded to the South's demand to count enslaved people partially, they also ensured that the South would shoulder a greater tax burden based on their population, including enslaved people. 3. Consequences for slavery. The compromise entrenched slavery by embedding it into the Constitution, indirectly acknowledging the institution and creating political power for slaveholding states. Aftermath and legacy. The Three-Fifths Compromise lasted until the abolition of slavery after the Civil War. It was rendered moot by the 13th Amendment in 1865, which abolished slavery in the United States. It is often cited as a glaring example of the compromises made to accommodate slavery during the formation of the U.S. Constitution. The moral and political ramifications of this compromise are significant, as it highlights the deep divisions over slavery that would eventually lead to the Civil War. The Three-Fifths Compromise reflected the deep unresolved tensions regarding slavery in the early United States, where economic and political power were closely tied to the institution of slavery. 3. Fugitive Slave Act, 1793-1850. These laws allowed enslavers to recapture Black people who had escaped to free states, enforcing slavery even in places that outlawed it. The Fugitive Slave Act refers to two key laws passed in the United States, both of which dealt with the capture and return of enslaved people who had escaped from one state to another. The most notable and controversial was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But the first version was enacted much earlier, in 1793. Both laws were critical in the growing tensions between free and slave-holding states in the years leading up to the Civil War. Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. Background. Part of the Constitution, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, provided that a person held to service or labor who fled to another state must be returned to their owner. Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act to enforce this constitutional provision. Key features. Legal procedure for recapture. The 1793 Act allowed slaveholders or their agents to seize escaped enslaved people and present them before a judge or magistrate. If the judge was convinced by proof of ownership, the person would be returned to slavery. While the federal government mandated the return of escaped enslaved people, The act left enforcement largely in the hands of local and state authorities, and there was no strong federal apparatus to ensure compliance. Opposition and state resistance. Many northern states passed personal liberty laws, which were designed to protect free African Americans from being wrongfully captured and to obstruct enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. These laws mandated legal procedures that slowed down or hindered the recapture of fugitives, angering Southern slaveholders. Limitations. The act was relatively weak in terms of enforcement because it relied on local officials, some of whom were sympathetic to escaped enslaved people or outright abolitionists. The rising abolitionist sentiment and state-level resistance made it increasingly difficult for the law to be effectively enforced. Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Background. The 1850 law was passed as part of the Compromise of 1850, a series of measures intended to ease sectional tensions between the North and South. The new Fugitive Slave Act was far more stringent and controversial than the earlier version, provoking outrage in the North and heightening tensions over slavery. Key features. 1. Federal commissioners. The 1850 Act created a system of federal commissioners who had the authority to handle fugitive slave cases, bypassing state courts and local authorities. This gave the federal government far more power to enforce the return of fugitives. Number 2. No jury trial. Accused fugitives were denied the right to a jury trial. The commissioners were solely responsible for deciding the fate of the person accused of being a runaway slave. This provision made it easier for slaveholders to reclaim fugitives without much legal scrutiny. 3. Higher fees for commissioners. Commissioners received $10 if they ruled in favor of the slaveholder, confirming the person was a runaway, but only $5 if they ruled in favor of the accused fugitive. This financial incentive led to widespread criticism, as it appeared to encourage rulings in favor of the slaveholders. 4. Penalties for helping escaped enslaved people. Anyone who aided an escaped enslaved person or interfered with the capture process could face severe penalties, including fines of up to $1,000, a huge sum at the time, and up to 6 months in prison. This aimed to curtail abolitionist activities and undermine the Underground Railroad, a secret network that helped escaped slaves reach freedom. 5. Forced participation. U.S. Marshals and other officials were obligated to assist in the capture of fugitives, and any citizens, if called upon, were required to help with the recapture or face penalties. This was highly controversial in the North, as it effectively forced people to participate in the enforcement of slavery. Impact. Northern resistance. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 faced enormous resistance in the North. Many states passed new personal liberty laws to counteract the federal law, and some communities refused to cooperate with the law's enforcement. Northern abolitionists and activists formed vigilance committees to protect accused fugitives and actively resisted the law. Underground Railroad. The law also spurred greater activity in the Underground Railroad, as more enslaved people and free blacks sought safety in Canada, where U.S. law had no jurisdiction. Cases of resistance. Several high-profile cases, such as the Christiana Riot, 1851, and the Anthony Burns case, 1854, demonstrated widespread defiance of the law. In some cases, mobs attacked federal marshals attempting to enforce the law, leading to violent confrontations and further polarization between North and South. Consequences. Escalating sectional tensions. The 1850 Act was one of the key events that further deepened the divide between free and slaveholding states. It radicalized many Northerners who had previously been indifferent to slavery, turning them into active abolitionists. Civil disobedience. The law prompted significant civil disobedience, as individuals and entire communities openly defied it. For many Northerners, the moral obligation to oppose slavery outweighed the legal requirement to comply with federal law. Prelude to Civil War. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 helped set the stage for the Civil War, as it underscored the intractable differences between the North and South on the issue of slavery. The intense opposition to the law, coupled with Southern demands for its enforcement, made compromise on the issue increasingly impossible. Repeal and legacy. The Fugitive Slave Act was effectively repealed by Congress in 1864 during the Civil War as part of broader efforts to end slavery. The act is remembered today as a symbol of the lengths to which the federal government went to protect the institution of slavery and how deeply embedded slavery was in the fabric of the American legal and political system. It also illustrates the growing power of the abolitionist movement and the increasing moral and legal challenges to slavery that would culminate in the Civil War and the 13th Amendment. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, in particular, played a crucial role in inflaming the national debate over slavery, bringing the U.S. closer to the sectional conflict that would ultimately lead to the Civil War. Jim Crow laws, late 1800s to 1960s. After the Civil War, Southern states, with the government's support, enacted laws mandating racial segregation and disenfranchising Black people, limiting their rights and access to education, housing, and employment. Were a series of state and local statutes in the United States that enforced racial segregation and disenfranchised African Americans, primarily in the Southern states, from the late 19th century through the mid-20th century. These laws were named after a derogatory minstrel show character, Jim Crow, and institutionalized a system of oppression that relegated Black Americans to second-class citizenship. Historical context. Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877. After the Civil War, the Reconstruction period saw significant advancements for African Americans, including the ratification of the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery, the 14th Amendment, granting citizenship and equal protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment, ensuring voting rights regardless of race. During Reconstruction, federal troops were stationed in the South to protect the rights of newly freed Black Americans. End of Reconstruction. In 1877, Reconstruction ended with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South as part of the Compromise of 1877. This allowed Southern states to implement laws that reversed many of the gains made by African Americans during Reconstruction. Key elements of Jim Crow laws. 1. Racial segregation. Jim Crow laws mandated the segregation of African Americans and whites in public places, schools, transportation, and facilities like restaurants, restrooms, and drinking fountains. Signs reading, "Whites only," and "Colored" were common throughout the South. The doctrine of separate but equal was established by the landmark Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision in 1896. The ruling stated that racial segregation was constitutional as long as the separate facilities for Blacks and whites were equal in quality. In practice, however, facilities for African Americans were grossly inferior, underfunded, and often non-existent. 2. Disenfranchisement. Voting restrictions. Despite the 15th Amendment, Southern states employed a variety of methods to prevent Black people from voting, such as poll taxes, requiring voters to pay a fee to vote, which disproportionately affected poor African Americans. Literacy tests, requiring potential voters to pass reading and comprehension tests that were often deliberately confusing and inconsistently administered. Grandfather clauses. These laws allowed individuals to bypass literacy tests and poll taxes if their grandfathers had the right to vote before the Civil War, effectively excluding African Americans while allowing poor whites to vote. Violence and intimidation. Black people who tried to vote were often met with threats, violence, or even death at the hands of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, KKK. 3. Economic exploitation. African Americans were subjected to sharecropping and tenant farming systems, which kept them economically dependent on white landowners. These exploitative practices often resulted in a cycle of debt, poverty, and limited opportunities for African Americans. Labor segregation. Jim Crow laws restricted job opportunities for Black people, confining them to low-wage, menial jobs and limiting their upward mobility. 4. Social and legal inequality. African Americans were systematically denied access to quality education, healthcare, and housing. White supremacist attitudes, reinforced by Jim Crow laws, permeated all levels of society, leading to severe discrimination in everyday life. Interracial marriage. Many states banned interracial marriage, with laws known as anti-miscegenation laws, reinforcing the racial hierarchy and ensuring the separation of races. Key examples of Jim Crow laws. 1. Schools. Schools were segregated by race, with black children forced to attend separate schools that were underfunded and overcrowded. This severely limited their educational opportunities and reinforced the notion of racial inferiority. 2. Transportation. Black Americans were forced to sit in separate sections of buses and trains, typically at the back or in designated colored sections. The most famous challenge to this practice occurred in 1955 when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, sparking the Montgomery bus boycott. 3. Public accommodations. African Americans were barred from entering many public spaces like restaurants, theaters, hotels, and parks. Even public restrooms and water fountains were segregated, with facilities for African Americans often being poorly maintained compared to those for whites. Number 4, criminal justice system. The legal system was heavily biased against African Americans, with all white juries and judges often meting out harsher punishments to black defendants. Many southern states also had convict leasing systems, where prisoners, many of them black, were forced into labor for private companies, creating a new form of economic exploitation similar to slavery. Violence and intimidation. Lynching. The period of Jim Crow laws was marked by widespread racial violence, including the lynching of thousands of African Americans. Lynching was a form of extrajudicial killing, often by white mobs, used to enforce white supremacy and terrorize black communities. Race riots. The early 20th century saw numerous race riots where white mobs attacked black neighborhoods. One of the most notorious was the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, where a prosperous black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, was destroyed by white residents. Resistance to Jim Crow, black resistance. Despite the harsh oppression of Jim Crow laws, African Americans continually resisted through various means, including the NAACP, founded in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, was instrumental in challenging Jim Crow laws through the courts. Their efforts led to several landmark cases, including Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which declared that segregated schools were inherently unequal and unconstitutional. Civil rights movement. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s directly confronted Jim Crow laws through acts of civil disobedience, legal challenges, and mass protests. Key events include the Montgomery bus boycott, the Freedom Rides, the March on Washington, and the Selma to Montgomery marches. Black churches and organizations. African American churches and organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, played crucial roles in organizing resistance to segregation and disenfranchisement. The end of Jim Crow. The end of Jim Crow, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. This landmark Supreme Court case ruled that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional, striking a major blow against the separate but equal doctrine. Civil Rights Act of 1964. This federal law outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in employment, public accommodations, and federally funded programs. It was a critical step in dismantling Jim Crow laws. Voting Rights Act of 1965. This law aimed to eliminate barriers to voting for African Americans, such as literacy tests and poll taxes, ensuring federal oversight of elections in areas where voter suppression was rampant. 5. Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld racial segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal, which led to decades of legalized discrimination against Black Americans. The case of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, is one of the most infamous decisions in United States Supreme Court history. It established the doctrine of separate but equal, which provided constitutional justification for racial segregation in public facilities, primarily in the southern United States, for more than half a century. This case entrenched Jim Crow laws, allowing segregation to persist and intensifying racial discrimination against African Americans. Background of the case: post-Reconstruction era. After the end of Reconstruction in 1877, Southern states began to pass laws that severely restricted the rights of African Americans. These laws were collectively known as Jim Crow laws, and they mandated the segregation of Black people and whites in all aspects of life. schools, public transportation, restrooms, restaurants, and more. Segregation was a key mechanism through which white supremacy was maintained in the South, as it allowed whites to claim racial superiority while relegating black people to second-class status. The Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890, the specific law at the center of Plessy v. Ferguson, was the Louisiana Separate Car Act of 1890, which required railroads to provide equal but separate accommodations for the white and colored races. The law was part of a broader movement to formalize racial segregation in transportation. The law mandated that all passenger trains in Louisiana have separate cars for black and white passengers. Any person who violated the law by sitting in the wrong car would face a fine or imprisonment. Although the law claimed to provide equal accommodations, in reality, the facilities and cars for black passengers were usually inferior. The test case. In response to the law, a group of civil rights activists in Louisiana, known as the Citizens Committee, Comité de Citoyens, organized a test case to challenge the constitutionality of the Separate Car Act. They deliberately chose Homer Plessy, a man of mixed race, 7/8 white and 1/8 black, to test the law. Plessy could pass as white, but was legally considered black under Louisiana law, which classified anyone with African ancestry as black. Plessy boarded a whites-only car on the East Louisiana Railroad on June 7, 1892. As planned, Plessy informed the conductor of his racial background and refused to move to the colored car when asked. Plessy was subsequently arrested for violating the Separate Car Act and charged with breaking the law. The case was then taken to the courts to challenge whether the law violated the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, which were supposed to protect the rights of newly freed African Americans. Legal arguments. 1. Plessy's argument. Plessy's lawyers argued that the Separate Car Act violated the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, and the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection under the law. They argued that racial segregation in public facilities, including railroad cars, perpetuated a system of racial inferiority that violated the Constitution's guarantee of equal protection. 2. State's argument. The state of Louisiana argued that the law was within its rights to regulate railroad companies operating within its borders, and that the law did not imply the inferiority of African Americans. They claimed that the facilities were equal, even if they were separate, and that the law was not designed to discriminate, but to preserve social order. Supreme Court decision. The case eventually reached the U.S. Supreme Court, where the court delivered its ruling on May 18, 1896. In a 7-1 decision, the court ruled against Homer Plessy and upheld the constitutionality of the Louisiana law, thus establishing the doctrine of separate but equal. 1. Majority opinion. Justice Henry Billings Brown. The majority opinion, written by Justice Brown, argued that the 14th Amendment was intended to establish equality before the law, but did not intend to eliminate distinctions based on race or force social integration. The court claimed that as long as the separate facilities for black and white people were equal in quality, segregation did not violate the Constitution. Justice Brown famously stated, "If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them on the same plane." This rationale reinforced the idea that social differences were natural and that the government had no role in enforcing social equality. 2. Dissenting opinion. Justice John Marshall Harlan. The lone dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan, delivered a powerful dissent, arguing that the Constitution is colorblind and that all citizens, regardless of race, should be treated equally under the law. Harlan stated, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." He argued that segregation was inherently unequal because it was designed to place African Americans in a position of inferiority. Harlan's dissent became a rallying point for later civil rights activists and is remembered as one of the most famous dissenting opinions in Supreme Court history. Doctrine of separate but equal. The Plessy v. Ferguson decision solidified the legal basis for racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. This meant that as long as separate facilities, schools, transportation, public spaces were provided for black and white people, segregation did not violate the Constitution. In practice, however, the facilities for Black Americans were almost always inferior, less funding, poorer conditions, and fewer resources. Public schools. Black children were forced to attend segregated schools that were underfunded and overcrowded, leading to educational disparities that would persist for decades. Public transportation. African Americans were forced to use separate sections of buses and trains, often in more cramped and unsafe conditions. Public accommodations. Black people were barred from using the same restaurants, hotels, parks, and theaters as white people, reinforcing racial inferiority and social exclusion. Consequences of the ruling. Institutionalization of Jim Crow. The Plessy decision effectively legalized the Jim Crow system of racial segregation, which expanded across the South. It validated the state's rights to enforce laws that oppressed Black people and denied them access to the same quality of public services as white Americans. Widespread segregation. The ruling led to a dramatic increase in segregation, not only in public transportation, but in schools, hospitals, cemeteries, prisons, and other public spaces. Southern states passed a wave of new laws further entrenching segregation, which became a way of life in the South for nearly 60 years. Impact on civil rights. The Plessy decision made it clear that the fight for civil rights in America would be long and difficult. While the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been intended to grant freedom, equality, and voting rights to Black Americans, the Supreme Court's interpretation of those amendments in cases like Plessy effectively nullified their impact for generations. Overturning of Plessy, Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. The doctrine of separate but equal would remain the law of the land until 1954, when the Supreme Court overturned Plessy v. Ferguson in the landmark case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. In that case, the court ruled that racial segregation in public schools was inherently unequal, rejecting the notion that separate facilities could ever be truly equal. The Brown decision marked the beginning of the end of legally sanctioned racial segregation in the United States and provided momentum for the civil rights movement. The struggle to dismantle Jim Crow laws, however, would continue through the 1960s, culminating in the passage of landmark legislation such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Legacy of Plessy v. Ferguson. The Plessy v. Ferguson case left a lasting legacy in American history, as it sanctioned racial segregation and institutionalized inequality for generations of African Americans. The decision justified and strengthened white supremacy in the South, created a social and legal framework for racial discrimination, delayed progress toward racial equality for decades. The case remains a powerful reminder of the dangers of legalizing racial discrimination and the long struggle for civil rights in the United States. 6. Lynching and terror, late 1800s, early 1900s. Thousands of Black people were lynched in the U.S., often with local law enforcement complicit in or ignoring these acts of racial terror. The federal government failed to pass anti-lynching laws. 7. Redlining, 1930s to 1960s. Government policies, such as the Homeowners Loan Corporation, systematically denied mortgages to Black Americans in certain neighborhoods, limiting their ability to own homes and build wealth. Redlining is a discriminatory practice that systematically denied or limited financial services, especially mortgage lending, to people of color, particularly African Americans, based on the racial or ethnic composition of their neighborhoods. This practice emerged in the United States in the 1930s and continued for decades, shaping the landscape of racial inequality in housing and wealth accumulation. Historical background. The term redlining comes from the maps created by the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, during the New Deal era in the 1930s. HOLC was tasked with assessing the risk of offering home loans in different neighborhoods across the U.S., to stabilize the housing market during the Great Depression. The neighborhoods were color-coded based on perceived creditworthiness. Green, best. Neighborhoods considered desirable for investment, often predominantly white, affluent areas. Blue, still desirable. These areas were considered stable and still predominantly white. Yellow, definitely declining. These neighborhoods were seen as riskier, often due to the presence of working-class families or immigrants. Red, hazardous. Neighborhoods with significant African American or other minority populations deemed high risk for lending, regardless of the actual creditworthiness of individuals living there. Lenders used these maps to systematically deny mortgages and insurance to people living in redlined areas, which were often communities of color. The practice was institutionalized across banks and lending institutions, creating widespread barriers to homeownership for Black families and other minority groups. Effects of redlining on Black communities. Redlining had devastating long-term consequences for Black people and other marginalized groups. 1. Lack of access to homeownership. Homeownership is a key means of wealth accumulation. Redlining denied African Americans and other minorities the opportunity to buy homes in desirable areas, limiting their ability to build generational wealth through property appreciation. 2. Housing segregation. Redlining reinforced and exacerbated residential segregation. Black families were often confined to underfunded, segregated neighborhoods that lacked investment in infrastructure, schools, and public services. 3. Devaluation of property. Homes in redlined areas were devalued, further perpetuating the economic disadvantages faced by Black families. Even if Black families were able to purchase homes, the property was less likely to appreciate in value. 4. Urban decay and disinvestment. Redlined neighborhoods suffered from chronic underinvestment. Businesses were less likely to open in these areas. Infrastructure deteriorated, and public services like schools and parks received less funding. Over time, this contributed to the physical decline of these neighborhoods, creating cycles of poverty and disadvantage. 5. Disparities in wealth. Because housing is one of the most significant sources of wealth in the U.S., the denial of homeownership opportunities created a racial wealth gap that persists today. African American families have historically been unable to pass down the same level of wealth to future generations as their white counterparts. Legal and policy interventions. In 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed as part of the Civil Rights Act, which officially outlawed redlining and other forms of housing discrimination. However, the legacy of redlining persists due to decades of inequality in homeownership, community investment, and neighborhood development. While redlining was officially banned, some studies show that its effects continue. Minority communities are still often denied loans at higher rates than white communities, and neighborhoods that were once redlined remain underdeveloped compared to those that were favored by banks. Lasting impacts and current relevance. The impacts of redlining still shape housing patterns and racial wealth disparities today. Formerly redlined neighborhoods are often the same areas that struggle with poverty, underfunded schools, and higher rates of crime due to decades of disinvestment. In contrast, predominantly white suburban areas that received favorable treatment during the redlining era continue to be wealthier and better resourced. Moreover, modern practices like predatory lending, subprime mortgage lending, and gentrification reflect the ongoing structural challenges created by redlining. For instance, during the 2008 housing crisis, African Americans and other minorities were disproportionately targeted for subprime loans, even when they qualified for conventional loans. This resulted in higher rates of foreclosure in these communities, further undermining their economic stability. Redlining's legacy is a powerful reminder of how institutionalized racism has shaped the social and economic fabric of the United States, creating disparities in wealth, opportunity, and access to resources that persist across generations. 8. Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, 1932 to 1972. The U.S. Public Health Service conducted a study on Black men with syphilis, deliberately withholding treatment without their knowledge, leading to unnecessary suffering and deaths. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, often referred to as the Tuskegee Experiment, was an infamous unethical clinical study conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service between 1932 and 1972. The study involved 600 African American men from Macon County, Alabama, 399 of whom had syphilis, and 201 of whom did not. The men were largely poor and illiterate sharecroppers. Key points. Objective. The stated aim of the study was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis in Black men. However, the men were misled and told they were receiving free health care from the government. No treatment. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in 1947, the researchers withheld it from the participants. The men were left untreated, even though they could have been cured, and were instead subjected to painful tests and spinal taps under the guise of treatment. Lies and deception. The men were never informed that they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they had bad blood, a local term used to describe several ailments. They were promised free medical exams, meals, and burial insurance, which were strong incentives for impoverished participants. Consequences. Many of the men suffered and died from syphilis and related complications, and their wives and children were also infected. The public only learned about the study in 1972, following a leak by Peter Buxton, a whistleblower, leading to national outrage. End of the study. The study was terminated in 1972 after news of it sparked widespread condemnation. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the study's participants, leading to a $10 million settlement. The U.S. government also promised to provide lifetime medical benefits and burial services to all surviving participants and their families. Legacy. The Tuskegee experiment had long-lasting effects, deeply eroding trust in the healthcare system among African Americans and contributing to ongoing health disparities. In 1997, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology on behalf of the U.S. government to the survivors and their families. This experiment is a dark chapter in U.S. medical history and is often cited as a key example of racism in medicine and unethical research practices. 9. Mass incarceration, 1970s present. The war on drugs led to the disproportionate imprisonment of Black Americans. Harsh sentencing laws targeted Black communities, leading to mass incarceration and the devastation of families and communities. Mass incarceration of Black men in the United States has roots in several historical, political, and social factors, making it a complex issue. These factors include racism, economic inequality, and policy decisions that have disproportionately targeted communities of color. Here are some key reasons behind the mass incarceration of Black men. 1. Legacy of slavery and racism. After the abolition of slavery in 1865, systems of racial control shifted to new forms of oppression. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, but allowed involuntary servitude as punishment for a crime, which created a loophole. Black codes and Jim Crow laws were introduced in the post-Civil War era, criminalizing minor infractions like vagrancy or loitering in order to arrest and re-enslave Black men through the convict lease system. War on drugs. In the 1980s and 1990s, policies associated with the war on drugs, initiated under the Nixon administration and expanded during the Reagan and Clinton presidencies, led to a significant increase in incarceration rates, particularly for Black men. These policies disproportionately targeted Black communities, even though drug use rates between racial groups were similar. Crack cocaine versus powder cocaine sentencing disparities. Crack cocaine, more commonly found in poorer Black communities, had far harsher penalties than powder cocaine, more prevalent in wealthier white communities. This sentencing disparity led to significantly longer sentences for Black individuals. 3. Mandatory minimum sentences and three strikes laws. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws forced judges to impose long prison sentences for certain offenses, particularly drug-related crimes. This took away judicial discretion and led to lengthy incarcerations for nonviolent offenses, which disproportionately affected Black men. Three strikes laws imposed life sentences on repeat offenders after 3 felony convictions. These laws disproportionately impacted Black men because they were more likely to be arrested and charged with felonies, even for nonviolent crimes. 4. Over-policing of Black communities. There is a long history of over-policing in predominantly Black neighborhoods. Police departments tend to deploy more officers and conduct more aggressive patrolling in these areas, leading to higher arrest rates for minor infractions. Racial profiling and biased policing practices further contribute to the disproportionate arrest and incarceration rates of Black men. 5. Economic inequality and lack of opportunities. Black communities have historically faced economic disadvantages due to systemic racism in employment, housing, and education. Poverty and lack of access to quality education and job opportunities increase the likelihood of involvement in criminal activities. Without proper legal representation, many black men face harsher sentences than their white counterparts for similar offenses. 6. Private prison industry. The rise of the private prison industry created a financial incentive to incarcerate more people. The prison system has become highly profitable, with private companies benefiting from mass incarceration. These corporations often lobby for tougher laws and longer sentences, contributing to the growth of the prison population, particularly of black men. Hammer 7. Racial bias in the judicial system. Racial disparities persist at every level of the criminal justice system, from policing to sentencing. Black men are more likely to be arrested, charged, convicted, and receive longer sentences than white men for the same crimes. Implicit and explicit racial bias among law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges has contributed to these disparities. 8. Super predator, myth and fear-based politics. In the 1990s, the concept of the super predator was promoted, a racially charged myth suggesting that young black men were inherently more violent and prone to criminal behavior. This contributed to tough-on-crime policies and harsher policing, even though this theory was later discredited. Impact of mass incarceration. Family separation. High incarceration rates have led to the breakdown of black families, with many children growing up without fathers. Economic consequences. Incarceration has long-lasting effects on black men's ability to secure jobs and housing after release, further perpetuating cycles of poverty. Voter disenfranchisement. Many states disenfranchise people with felony convictions, effectively stripping many black men of their political power. In summary, mass incarceration of black men is the result of a combination of historical and modern factors that include systemic racism, discriminatory laws and policies, economic inequalities, and biased policing practices. These elements have reinforced a cycle of incarceration that continues to impact black communities today. 10. COINTELPRO, 1956 to 1971. The FBI's covert program targeted black civil rights leaders and organizations like the Black Panthers, aiming to undermine and destroy black activism through surveillance, infiltration, and violence. The FBI, through its infamous COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, actively targeted black leaders and organizations during the 1950s and 1960s, especially those involved in the civil rights movement and advocating for black empowerment. The primary goal was to neutralize what the FBI saw as threats to national security. But in reality, many of these efforts were aimed at suppressing political dissent, especially in black communities fighting for justice and equality. 1. COINTELPRO. An overview. COINTELPRO was a covert FBI program started in 1956 under Director J. Edgar Hoover to disrupt and discredit domestic political organizations that were considered subversive. While it initially targeted the Communist Party and other leftist groups, by the 1960s, it had expanded its focus to include black civil rights groups, black liberation organizations, and individuals who were prominent in the fight for racial justice. The stated goals of COINTELPRO were to prevent the rise of a black messiah, a charismatic black leader who could unify and inspire widespread resistance, discredit and disrupt black organizations that were seen as threats to the status quo, create divisions within these organizations and among their leaders, isolate black leaders from their communities and the broader American public. 2. Targeted black leaders. Many prominent black leaders were systematically harassed by the FBI through surveillance, disinformation campaigns, and even psychological warfare. Some key examples include Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI regarded King as a major threat because of his prominence in the civil rights movement. Hoover labeled him as the most dangerous Negro in the country. The FBI wiretapped his phones and hotel rooms, spreading information about his personal life in an attempt to tarnish his reputation and neutralize his influence. They even sent an anonymous letter to King encouraging him to commit suicide, falsely suggesting that damaging personal information about him would be revealed publicly. Malcolm X. Malcolm X, as a leader of the Nation of Islam and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity, was another major target. The FBI monitored his activities closely, infiltrated his organizations, and sought to exploit divisions within black nationalist movements, particularly between Malcolm X and Nation of Islam leader Elijah Muhammad. These tensions were exacerbated by government interference. Black Panther Party, formed in 1966, was one of the primary targets of COINTELPRO. The Panthers' message of black empowerment, self-defense, and community control resonated with many African Americans, but it was seen as a radical threat by the FBI. The FBI worked to dismantle the organization by infiltrating and sowing internal discord. FBI informants were placed inside the Panthers to spread misinformation, create conflicts, and provoke violence. Harassing leaders. Prominent members like Huey P. Newton, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver, and Fred Hampton were constantly surveilled, harassed, and in some cases arrested on questionable charges. Assassination of Fred Hampton. One of the most notorious examples of FBI involvement was the 1969 assassination of Fred Hampton, the young, charismatic leader of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. The FBI worked with local police to orchestrate a raid on Hampton's apartment, where he was shot and killed while sleeping. The FBI's informant, William O'Neill, had provided a floor plan of the apartment, leading to his assassination. Marcus Garvey. Although his case predates COINTELPRO, Marcus Garvey, an early 20th century black nationalist and leader of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, was targeted by the FBI, then called the Bureau of Investigation. Garvey's efforts to promote black self-determination and his establishment of the Back to Africa movement worried U.S. authorities. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, pursued him aggressively and ultimately succeeded in imprisoning him for mail fraud, a charge many saw as politically motivated. 3. Targeted organizations. Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. Led by Martin Luther King Jr., this civil rights organization was closely monitored by the FBI, with efforts to discredit King as a way of undermining the movement's credibility. Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC was instrumental in organizing sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives, especially in the South. As the group became more radical in its demands for black power, it increasingly became a target of FBI surveillance and infiltration. Nation of Islam. The FBI was particularly concerned about the Nation of Islam's separatist rhetoric and its influence on black communities. The FBI used informants to monitor the organization, especially its leaders like Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. After Malcolm X's break from the Nation, the FBI monitored the growing tensions between Malcolm and the Nation's leadership. 4. Tactics used by the FBI. Surveillance. The FBI engaged in extensive surveillance of black leaders and organizations, including phone tapping, mail interception, and infiltration by informants. Infiltration. The FBI planted informants in organizations like the Black Panther Party, SNCC, and the Nation of Islam to gather intelligence, create division, and provoke violent confrontations. Disinformation and smear campaigns. The FBI sought to discredit black leaders by spreading false or damaging information. For example, they used forged letters and fake news reports to create rifts between leaders or undermine their credibility in the media and public opinion. Psychological warfare. The FBI sent anonymous letters to leaders, such as the one to Martin Luther King Jr., urging him to commit suicide, or letters aimed at creating distrust between leaders and their followers. Police violence and legal harassment. In conjunction with local police, the FBI worked to disrupt black organizations through frequent arrests, raids, and violent confrontations, often on dubious grounds. The Black Panther Party, in particular, faced relentless police violence, with many of its members imprisoned or killed. 5. Long-term consequences. Destruction of black movements. The FBI's tactics severely weakened many of the most prominent black liberation organizations, leading to their fragmentation or collapse by the 1970s. The assassination of leaders like Fred Hampton and the harassment of others like King and Malcolm X had a devastating impact. Mistrust of the government. COINTELPRO created a lasting sense of mistrust between black communities and the federal government, particularly law enforcement. The program exemplified how state power was used to suppress legitimate struggles for equality and justice. Exacerbation of racial tensions. The FBI's actions, combined with systemic racism, deepened the divide between Black activists and the U.S. government, fostering a sense of betrayal and reinforcing the belief that Black people could not expect fairness or protection from the state. In 1971, the existence of COINTELPRO was revealed to the public after activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and exposed the documents. The revelation led to public outrage and the eventual dissolution of COINTELPRO, though the damage had already been done. 11. Environmental racism. The government has often allowed hazardous waste sites and polluting industries to be located near Black communities, exposing them to environmental harm. Flint, Michigan's water crisis, is a recent example. The Flint water crisis is a public health disaster that began in 2014 in Flint, Michigan, when the city's drinking water supply became contaminated with lead and other toxins. The crisis exposed government mismanagement, negligence, and environmental racism, leading to long-term health and social consequences for the city's residents. Timeline and key events. 1. Switching the water source, April 2014. Flint, a majority Black, economically struggling city, was under state-appointed emergency management to address its financial problems. In a cost-saving move, officials switched Flint's water supply from the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department, which got water from Lake Huron, to the Flint River. This switch was supposed to be temporary, while a new pipeline was being constructed to supply water from Lake Huron directly. The Flint River had a reputation for being heavily polluted, and it was known that it had corrosive properties. However, officials did not treat the water with proper corrosion control chemicals, which are necessary to prevent the pipes from leaching lead into the water supply. 2. Water quality issues. Almost immediately, residents complained about the taste, smell, and appearance of the water. Some reported skin rashes, hair loss, and other health issues. Despite these complaints, officials repeatedly reassured the public that the water was safe. The water also contained high levels of bacteria, including E. coli, leading the city to issue boil water advisories. As a solution, they increased the chlorine levels in the water, which led to an outbreak of Legionnaire's disease, killing at least 12 people and sickening many more. 3. Lead contamination, 2014-2015. The real crisis came from the lead in the water. Flint's aging lead pipes, without the necessary corrosion control, started leaching lead into the water supply. Lead is a dangerous neurotoxin, especially harmful to children, affecting brain development and causing behavioral and cognitive issues. A group of researchers from Virginia Tech, led by Dr. Mark Edwards, conducted independent testing of Flint's water in 2015. They found elevated levels of lead, confirming residents' worst fears. Dr. Mona Hanna Atisha, a local pediatrician, also revealed a spike in the blood lead levels in Flint's children. 4. Government response and cover-up. Despite the mounting evidence, local, state, and federal officials downplayed the crisis. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, MDQ, insisted that the water was safe, manipulating test results to mask the severity of the problem. In October 2015, after overwhelming pressure from activists, scientists, and the public, Flint switched back to Detroit's water supply, but the damage had already been done. The city's pipes had been so corroded by the Flint River water that lead continued to leach into the water even after the switch. 5. Federal involvement and legal action, 2016 to present. In January 2016, President Barack Obama declared a federal state of emergency in Flint, providing federal funds to address the crisis. The city began distributing bottled water and water filters, but it was a temporary solution to a long-term problem. Numerous lawsuits were filed against local and state officials, as well as engineering firms involved in the decision-making. Michigan's governor at the time, Rick Snyder, faced intense criticism for his administration's role in the crisis. In 2017, a $97 million settlement was reached to replace the lead pipes in Flint by 2020, although delays have slowed progress. 6. Criminal charges. In 2016, several officials were criminally charged for their roles in the crisis, including 2 state-appointed emergency managers and officials from the MDEQ. In 2021, Governor Rick Snyder, along with other officials, was charged with willful neglect of duty. However, the charges were relatively minor compared to the gravity of the crisis, and no one has been fully held accountable for the widespread harm caused. Health and social consequences. Lead poisoning. Lead exposure can cause permanent developmental issues in children, including reduced IQ, attention disorders, and behavioral problems. Thousands of Flint children were exposed to unsafe levels of lead, creating long-term health challenges. Mental and physical health. Beyond lead poisoning, residents suffered from anxiety, PTSD, and other mental health issues stemming from the crisis. The distrust in government and water safety caused widespread emotional and psychological stress. Economic impact. Flint residents, many of whom were already economically disadvantaged, had to spend additional money on bottled water and medical care, exacerbating financial hardships. The city's reputation also suffered, and many businesses and residents left the area, further harming the local economy. Environmental racism. The Flint water crisis is often cited as a case of environmental racism because it disproportionately affected a poor, predominantly Black community. Decision makers failed to listen to the concerns of Flint's residents, many of whom had little political power to demand accountability. The crisis reflects how marginalized communities are often treated when it comes to public health and environmental protection. Current status: water safety. Although the water quality has improved, and Flint is once again receiving water from Detroit, many residents still do not trust the tap water. The process of replacing lead service lines continues, but it has been slow, and many Flint residents still rely on bottled water for their daily needs. Ongoing litigation. Several lawsuits are still pending, and some settlements have been reached. In 2020, a $600 million settlement was announced for victims of the Flint water crisis, the majority of which will go to children exposed to lead. The Flint water crisis is a stark reminder of the consequences of government mismanagement, lack of accountability, and how structural racism can amplify the suffering of marginalized communities. Before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. We've got plenty more exciting videos coming your way, and you won't want to miss them. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.